This is TTS Times Wire News, providing fast and efficient narrations of the latest news articles for those on the go. We upload every weekday at noon Eastern Standard Time. Be sure to like and subscribe. The New York Times. nytimes.com. Facebook executives have battled internally over transparency. By Kevin Roose. July 14, 2021. One day in April, the people behind CrowdTangle, a data analytics tool owned by Facebook, learned that transparency had limits. Brandon Silverman, CrowdTangle's co-founder and chief executive, assembled dozens of employees on a video call to tell them that they were being broken up. CrowdTangle, which had been running quasi-independently inside Facebook since being acquired in 2016, was being moved under the social network's integrity team, the group trying to rid the platform of misinformation and hate speech. Some CrowdTangle employees were being reassigned to other divisions, and Mr. Silverman would no longer be managing the team day to day. The announcement, which left CrowdTangle's employees in stunned silence, was the result of a year-long battle among Facebook executives over data transparency and how much the social network should reveal about its inner workings. On one side were executives, including Mr. Silverman and Brian Boland, a Facebook vice president in charge of partnerships strategy, who argued that Facebook should publicly share as much information as possible about what happens on its platform, good, bad, or ugly. On the other side were executives, including the company's chief marketing officer and vice president of analytics, Alex Schultz, who worried that Facebook was already giving away too much. They argued that journalists and researchers were using CrowdTangle, a kind of turbocharged search engine that allows users to analyze Facebook trends and measure post performance, to dig up information they considered unhelpful, showing, for example, that right-wing commentators like Ben Shapiro and Dan Bongino were getting much more engagement on their Facebook pages than mainstream news outlets. These executives argued that Facebook should selectively disclose its own data in the form of carefully curated reports, rather than handing outsiders the tools to discover it themselves. Team Selective Disclosure won, and CrowdTangle and its supporters lost. An internal battle over data transparency might seem low on the list of worthy Facebook investigations. And it's a column I've hesitated to write for months, in part because I'm uncomfortably close to the action. More on that in a minute. But the CrowdTangle story is important, because it illustrates the way that Facebook's obsession with managing its reputation often gets in the way of its attempts to clean up its platform. And it gets to the heart of one of the central tensions confronting Facebook in the post-Trump era. The company, blamed for everything from election interference to vaccine hesitancy, badly wants to rebuild trust with a skeptical public, but the more it shares about what happens on its platform, the more it risks exposing uncomfortable truths that could further damage its image. The question of what to do about CrowdTangle has vexed some of Facebook's top executives for months, according to interviews with more than a dozen current and former Facebook employees, as well as internal emails and posts. These people, most of whom would speak only anonymously because they were not authorized to discuss internal conversations, said Facebook's executives were more worried about fixing the perception that Facebook was amplifying harmful content than figuring out whether it actually was amplifying harmful content. Transparency, they said, ultimately took a backseat to image management. Facebook disputes this characterization. It says that the CrowdTangle reorganization was meant to integrate the service with its other transparency tools, not weaken it, and that top executives are still committed to increasing transparency. CrowdTangle is part of a growing suite of transparency resources we've made available for people, including academics and journalists, said Joe Osborne, a Facebook spokesman. With CrowdTangle moving into our integrity team, we're developing a more comprehensive strategy for how we build on some of these transparency efforts moving forward. But the executives who pushed hardest for transparency appear to have been sidelined. Mr. Silverman, CrowdTangle's co-founder and chief executive, has been taking time off and no longer has a clearly defined role at the company, several people with knowledge of the situation said. Mr. Silverman declined to comment about his status, and Mr. Boland, who spent 11 years at Facebook, left the company in November. One of the main reasons that I left Facebook is that the most senior leadership in the company does not want to invest in understanding the impact of its core products, Mr. Boland said, in his first interview since departing. And it doesn't want to make the data available for others to do the hard work and hold them accountable. Mr. Boland, who oversaw CrowdTangle as well as other Facebook transparency efforts, said the tool fell out of favor with influential Facebook executives around the time of last year's presidential election, when journalists and researchers used it to show that pro-Trump commentators were spreading misinformation and hyperpartisan commentary with stunning success. People were enthusiastic about the transparency CrowdTangle provided until it became a problem and created press cycles Facebook didn't like, he said. Then, the tone at the executive level changed. The Twitter account that launched 1,000 meetings. Here's where I, somewhat reluctantly, come in. I started using CrowdTangle a few years ago. I'd been looking for a way to see which news stories gained the most traction on Facebook, and CrowdTangle, a tool used mainly by audience teams at news publishers and marketers who want to track the performance of their posts, filled the bill. I figured out that through a kludgy workaround, I could use its search feature to rank Facebook linked posts, that is, posts that include a link to a non-Facebook site, in order of the number of reactions, shares and comments they got. Linked posts weren't a perfect proxy for news, engagement wasn't a perfect proxy for popularity, and CrowdTangle's data was limited in other ways, but it was the closest I'd come to finding a kind of cross-Facebook news leaderboard, so I ran with it. At first, Facebook was happy that I and other journalists were finding its tool useful. With only about 25,000 users, CrowdTangle is one of Facebook's smallest products, but it has become a valuable resource for power users including global health organizations, election officials and digital marketers, and it has made Facebook look transparent compared with rival platforms like YouTube and TikTok, which don't release nearly as much data. But the mood shifted last year when I started a Twitter account called at Facebook's Top 10, on which I posted a daily leaderboard showing the sources of the most engaged link posts by US pages, based on CrowdTangle data. Last fall, the leaderboard was full of posts by Mr. Trump and pro-Trump media personalities. Since Mr. Trump was barred from Facebook in January, it has been dominated by a handful of right-wing polemicists like Mr. Shapiro, Mr. Bongino and Sean Hannity, with the occasional mainstream news article, cute animal story or K-pop fan blog sprinkled in. The account went semi-viral, racking up more than 35,000 followers. Thousands of people retweeted the lists, including conservatives who were happy to see pro-Trump pundits beating the mainstream media and liberals who shared them with jokes like "Look at all this conservative censorship." If you've been under a rock for the past 2 years, conservatives in the United States frequently complain that Facebook is censoring them. The lists also attracted plenty of Facebook haters. Liberals shared them as evidence that the company was a swamp of toxicity that needed to be broken up. Progressive advertisers bristled at the idea that their content was appearing next to pro-Trump propaganda. The account was even cited at a congressional hearing on tech and antitrust by Representative Jamie Raskin, Democrat of Maryland, who said it proved that if Facebook is out there trying to suppress conservative speech, they're doing a terrible job at it. Inside Facebook, the account drove executives crazy. Some believed that the data was being misconstrued and worried that it was painting Facebook as a far-right echo chamber. Others worried that the list might spook investors by suggesting that Facebook's US user base was getting older and more conservative. Every time a tweet went viral, I got grumpy calls from Facebook executives who were embarrassed by the disparity between what they thought Facebook was, a clean, well-lit public square where civility and tolerance reign, and the image they saw reflected in the Twitter lists. As the election approached last year, Facebook executives held meetings to figure out what to do, according to 3 people who attended them. They set out to determine whether the information on Facebook's Top 10 was accurate. It was, and discussed starting a competing Twitter account that would post more balanced lists based on Facebook's internal data. They never did that, but several executives, including John Heekman, the head of Facebook's news feed, were dispatched to argue with me on Twitter. These executives argued that my top 10 lists were misleading. They said CrowdTangle measured only engagement, while the true measure of Facebook popularity would be based on reach, or the number of people who actually see a given post. With the exception of video views, reach data isn't public, and only Facebook employees and page owners have access to it. Thanks for joining us at TTS Times Wire News. Be sure to like and subscribe to get fast and efficient narrations of the latest news articles for those on the go. We upload every weekday at noon Eastern Standard Time. See you next time on The Wire, and be sure to like and subscribe.